Side Street was an excellent crime film from 1950 directed by Anthony Mann, and it starred Farley Granger and Kathy O'Donnell. I really enjoyed this film, and thanks to my friend Florida Greg for this recommendation. I'll give an overview of the film and then bring in some closing thoughts. Well, the film opens up with the flyover of New York City, and we hear the voice of Captain Walter Anderson. It's played by actor Paul Kelly, who gives us an overview of crime statistics in the city. And all along we see this copious footage of the city, and that's one of the things I really loved about this film. It really felt like you were in the heart of New York City because of all of the generous location footage that was used through the film. It barely felt like you were on a Hollywood set at all. You have to watch the film and you'll see what I mean. And we're introduced to the character of Joe Norson, played here by actor Farley Granger. Now, his character is a mail carrier, and he briefly stops to chat with one of his police friends and talks to him about his ambitions of having a lot of money and traveling to Paris and things like that. And then he returns back to his day job of delivering the mail. Well, he brings the mail into some suspicious-looking fellows and notices some money on the floor that he tries to pick up, but they stop him. The character Victor Backett is played by actor Edmund Ryan. He is this shady lawyer, and he's on the phone with his girl. And also there is the character George Garcelle, played by actor James Craig. I actually caught him not long ago in a Hopalong Cassidy movie, and he's the tough guy working for Vic. Well, Joe is out delivering the mail the next day, and he cautiously returns to this office. And while no one is there, he breaks into a filing cabinet, and knowing that these guys had money they were messing around with, he's able to find it, and he takes it and steals it. And he scurries off all nervous, goes to a nearby rooftop, and he grabs out the money out of the envelope and discovers that instead of just a couple $100, he's actually taken $30,000. The situation is that the money is actually blackmail money that has come from this old guy named Emil Lorison, played by actor Paul Harvey, that these guys, Backett and Garcelle, had basically blackmailed from him through the work of Lucille Kolner, played by actress Adele Jurgens. So they took all this money from him, and now our friend Joe has come along and taken it for himself. So back at his parents' house, Joe is feeling really guilty. He just kind of throws himself on the bed in guilt, and he's not sure what to do. And to be honest, some of his actions that follow did seem a little bit goofy. I mean, I get it. He's afraid to just go to the cops, to confess what he did. But considering the events that follow in the film, it seems like he could have saved himself a lot of trouble if he had just done that. But instead, we'll see what happens with the story. He builds up a lie to cover what happened. And when his wife arrives, it's the character Ellen, played by the lovely actress Kathy O'Donnell. He just makes up this story about how he has a new job from an old friend. It's often Schenectady, and how he wants his wife, who is pregnant with their baby, to be able to see a real doctor and not just go to a clinic. Now, she loves him and believes in him, but he continues to be weighed down by the guilt of his decision. So Joe heads to a local bar, and he leaves this packet with his bartender friend Nick, actor Edwin Max, saying it's a surprise nightgown for his wife, but it's actually the money. And then he heads out and checks into his own seedy place all alone. So he's really kind of building onto this lie as best he can. Now we cut to a crime scene with a group of detectives. They are investigating the murder of the character Lucille. Remember the part of the blackmail scheme from before. So they found her in the East River, strangled. Captain Anderson kind of continues his investigation to try to close in on the killer. So Joe, meanwhile, goes to see his wife, who's just given birth. And, he's very emotional to see his son. He's very happy. And we can tell that he's resolved. He's got to make things right and get rid of this money. So he goes back to the bar to visit Nick to get his money. But he finds out that this guy is retired and sold the place. So there's a moment of tension, but thankfully the new bartender is able to find his packet. He takes it and he goes to Backett and tries to return the money. But Backett, who suspects a trap or a setup, denies there was any money and he refuses it. However, Beckett sends the character Garcelle and this taxi driver character Giff, played by Harry Belaver, who I caught not long ago in the film No Way Out, sends the two of them to grab Joe to recover the loot, rough him up and stuff. However, they discover that the Nick Drummond guy from the bar apparently had taken the money for himself and left only the nightgown behind in this packet. So these thugs aren't happy, but Joe manages to get away from them doing this very dangerous looking stunt where he flings himself out of the car. It was actually kind of impressive. So Joe goes back to the bar to find out what happened with Nick and his money. And he gets to know the new owner briefly, the guy named Gus, is played by John Gallaudet, and finds out that Nick sold the place. So he gets an address to go find Nick, but discovers he's been killed. So at this point, it's all been weighing on him so much that he goes to sneak into the maternity ward late that night to see his wife, and finally confesses everything. Now, she says to just call the police, but he says he just needs to run away. So Joe goes to the bank to try to track down whoever it was that withdrew the money in order to clear his name. And honestly, the lengths that this character goes to, seeing that he's a mail carrier, it did start to seem a little ridiculous by this point, but it's all good. He manages to track down Garcelle's girlfriend, the character Harriet, played by actress Jean Hagen. And she's a club singer. She's something of an alcoholic. We get to see her sing a little bit. And then he meets with her, tries to ply her with booze, and she finally talks, reveals that she was in a relationship with George. But she starts to grow suspicious of him, and she invites him back to her place where thugs have been alerted and they're waiting there to beat him up. Garcelle, however, he strangles Harriet to death in the backseat of the car in order to prevent her from talking to the police. And then he and Giff take this character Joe in their cab, and they head to the river where they intend to kill him. All along, the police are moving in, and there's this big, exciting chase scene that takes place. Now, with only a little bit of time left in the film, I won't give any more spoilers of the ending, but it's a really neat conclusion, as there's a chase scene through New York City. So some closing thoughts about the movie Side Street. It was produced by MGM and was directed by Anthony Mann, who also directed films like The Great Flammarion and 2 O'Clock Courage, which were some of the films I've reviewed on this channel before. I like his movies, and I believe this was his final film noir, and after this he would make mostly westerns. What was notable about this film for me is how much location footage was incorporated from the streets of New York City from 1950. It's very immersive, and you really feel like this story was taking place in the actual city. At points, the film would utilize the buildings so well that you almost felt claustrophobic, like Joe's fate was closing in on him. And with the driving that took place around those narrow streets of lower Manhattan, it really felt like you were there. And it was also great to see one of the earliest car chase scenes, which you don't really see very often in these old movies, and I really enjoyed that. So again, it's always fascinating to see that window into what the world and what the city looked like back in the 1950s. The film was fine in terms of being an enjoyable crime story with believable characters, but I will admit that the film did feel a little bit convoluted at times, and as mentioned, Farley Granger's character Joe really makes a bunch of silly decisions through the film, and then makes kind of a bunch of executive decisions that don't really seem believable from someone like a mail carrier. But it's all good. I still enjoyed the story, and you do believe in his character. And I really do like Farley Granger as an actor. I think he's very believable in whatever role that he is in, and regardless of how nutty the story might be, we really want to see him work things out. I've seen him before, obviously, in Hitchcock films like Rope and Strangers on a Train, where it seems like he always gets cast into this morally ambiguous role. Like this one in this film, where he's basically a good guy thrown into a bad situation, and he's trying to make things right again. He's got a likable character to him, and you really want to see him make things right, especially as he's ultimately a well-meaning family guy with a wife and a baby. He made the bad decision to make their life better, and we just want to see him get untangled from this big criminal mess that he's stuck in. But alas, even when he tries to return the money and do the right thing, the situation just gets worse. Kathy O'Donnell played his lovely young wife in this film, and while researching this, I discovered that this is actually the second time they've acted together. Their earlier film was a crime story, They Live by Night, from 1948. So yes, you can bet that will be a future review on this channel, and actually, I think Florida Greg already recommended that one as well, so it's on my list. Jean Hagen was also great as the lounge singer in this film, and I've seen her before in films like The Asphalt Jungle, where she played opposite of Sterling Hayden. And although she's briefly in this film, I thought that her role was great as that boozy singer who may or may not be able to help out the character Joe. Now, one of the things I like to point out in these old reviews are those likable co-stars who, although not necessarily headlining in the film, I still enjoy seeing, and that was the case here with John Gallaudet, who was briefly here as the bartender. I have seen him in a couple other roles, and he seemed like just a decent and a friendly bartender here who genuinely wanted to help out Joe. I mean, heck, he even gave him a free drink. I've seen him in other films like Double Jeopardy that I reviewed on this channel a while ago. He was a police detective in that movie, and I just thought he was an enjoyable character. You know, from time to time, if I see somebody in a role like this, I just want to give him a shout out because I enjoyed it and I'd like to see other movies that he's in. Anyhow, that's my rambling review of Side Street from 1950. This is a very enjoyable crime film. Farley Granger is very convincing as the wrong man in the wrong place, trying to make everything right. It had amazing location footage around New York City that really added to the crime noir feel of this film. And it was just a very enjoyable story. Maybe a little convoluted, but I still liked it, and I think it's a film worth checking out.